Yeah. If you don't start, we can never go.
That's true. Hi everyone, my name is Meredith Garrison and I'm Jada Schaefer's older cousin, and this is my husband Steven.
Hi.
And we were asked to talk a little bit about Bolivia because we lived there for about 4 months when we were missionaries and volunteers doing global development work. So we'll talk a little bit about our experience.
Yeah. So my job primarily in Bolivia during the 4 months that we were there was working with a project that brought clean water to people in rural villages. Specifically, we worked in an area that was on the border of Bolivia and Paraguay called El Chaco. It's kind of like a desert, but not nearly as sandy. It was more just like dust that blew around all over the place, so pretty terrible conditions. And I worked in a village of about 500 people drilling wells and teaching people about how to sustainably source water that was safe to drink. So
yeah. So I worked in the city of Santa Cruz, which is about 3 million people?
3 or 4 million people.
3 or 4 million people, which is where we lived, and it's also in the desert area, so it's very dry and dusty there. I lived there working at an organization called El Aferero, and that organization works primarily with college students, but we did a lot of work with women and children, so college-age women who were coming out of domestic violence situations, extreme poverty, prostitution, things like that, and any children that they had with them, they would bring in. So some of them live with in the home where I was working. Some of them were just there for job training or free counseling and those kinds of things. So a couple of things I guess to know about Bolivia and Santa Cruz is that Bolivia is right in the middle of South America, and it has the highest rates of poverty. Because it's in the middle, it's also one of the most ethnically and biodiverse countries in South America. So it has the Andes Mountains on the west coast, and it has to the north, the Amazon rainforest, and then of course the Chaco Desert, which is kind of where we were. And so there's a lot of diversity in terms of like rural areas like where Steven was working and urban areas like where I was working. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the similarities and differences that we experienced and kind of what it was like to live there.
Yeah, so working in the rural villages, I guess some of the biggest differences were that most of these rural villages had no electricity, no plumbing, and specifically the villages I worked in, most of the houses were made out of mud, so they were a sort of adobe huts? Is that what it is? Adobe huts, yeah. Adobe sort of mud huts. And I remember one of the last weeks that we were there, I actually saw the first power lines being brought into this town of over 500 people. And that was a pretty interesting thing to see because most of the local people had no idea what to think of it. Also, very limited communication from these rural villages. This whole village of 500 people had to share one satellite phone booth to be able to call into the bigger city. And they had a bus that came through every other week to bring supplies or to take people to and from the village. So most of these people didn't have a car. If they needed to get somewhere, they had to wait 2 weeks just to be able to get a chance at getting a bus ticket. So pretty crazy. But some of the similarities, people were super hospitable. We were doing work that they really appreciated, and people were always willing to open up their homes. They were always willing to feed us. They were always willing to let me hang a hammock in their front yard and sleep in their front yard because that's what I did. So yeah, that was kind of the similarities and differences that I experienced.
Yeah, so for me, being in a bigger city most of the time, one of the things that I kind of had to figure out really right off the bat was public transportation, and Steven did too. And I remember having a really hard time with taxis. So one of the differences that I noticed in my first couple of weeks there is really strict gender roles between men and women. And being from the United States, I typically, as a woman, feel like my voice is mostly heard most of the time. And in Bolivia, sometimes I felt like when I was trying to like talk to a male cab driver or something like that, they didn't really listen to me, and so that was one of the harder differences for me to overcome. So I would take the bus a lot, which is called a micro, and it means tiny, and there were like 18 seats on the bus, really tiny.
18 seats and about 60 people.
About 60 people on average would get in the bus, so my commute to work was I had to make a 2-bus switch every day. And so it took me about an hour to get to work, even though if somebody came and picked me up in a car, it would take like 15 minutes to take public transportation, which is not something I do in Lexington. Took about an hour. And so sometimes I would be hanging out the side of the bus on my way to work. And, you know, if you get one hand on the bus, you're on.
Yeah.
So
the bus drivers would always say that there's more room, no matter how many people or animals or children or goats or chickens there was always more room on the bus.
The bus was an interesting place. Sometimes Stephen couldn't stand up all the way in the bus.
Buses were not made for people over 5.5 feet tall.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're for fairly short people. Lots of Bolivian people are kind of short. So, and they were not meant to be comfortable necessarily. So, we would get on the bus and always would have kind of a look at each other like, oh my gosh, did you see that person with a chicken and a duck on this bus?
Live chicken and a live duck.
Live chicken and a live duck would be on the bus with us. So,
so talking about some of the holidays and festivals that we were aware of or were able to experience, we actually didn't get to experience a whole lot of holidays or festivals in the short time that we were there. But Bolivia has a very rich indigenous culture with lots of native festivals. It's also deeply Catholic, so they celebrate all of the liturgical festivals, Advent leading into Christmas, and Lent leading into Easter. There's always big celebrations in the town square. But one of the most interesting holidays that we experienced was something called Pedestrian Day.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Pedestrian Day was a day for pedestrians. That was kind of my understanding. So they actually blocked off the entire town inner circle, which is kind of the downtown area.
A downtown area of over 4 million or over 3 million people. 3 to 4 million people live in this metropolitan area, and they blocked downtown just completely off.
And you couldn't get a car or a bus down there. So we were supposed to go to church that day, and they had to cancel church because no one could get to the church due to the buses not running that downtown that day. And I'm not really sure, aside from celebrating walking, what that was for.
I think it was a safety thing.
A safety, oh yeah.
Yeah, I think it was to try to bring awareness about people who did walk downtown, because with that many people, obviously there are probably frequent accidents. And also, it's not a very well regulated bus system. I don't know that you really have to have a whole lot of experience to be a driver. Overcrowded downtown area and lots of buses weaving in and out of traffic. It's bound to happen. So.
Talk a little bit about La Paz as well.
La Paz. So 1 week that we were there, we got to take a trip from Santa Cruz out to the mountain area in La Paz, which is in the western part of the country, closer to the Chilean border, I would say. And it's up in the Andes Mountains. We landed at El Alto Airport, which is the highest international airport in the world, highest elevation of any international airport in the world. So as soon as the cabin depressurizes, you have no oxygen.
Or very little.
Frequently, people get altitude sickness as soon as they get off the plane. And walking up a flight of stairs, you get super winded, and you're you feel super out of shape because there's there's less oxygen in the air. And La Paz is a very different area because it's definitely more, I would say, ethnically diverse than Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is a little bit more westernized, a little bit more sort of homogenous in the way that things sort of worked. But La Paz was very, very different. It had a very, very different vibe. Aside from being in the mountains and sort of being in this giant hillside, which was really interesting to see.
Yeah, they like built the city into the side of the mountain, so to take I've never seen a city that was anything like it. It was really strange.
Riding in a taxi in that city was very interesting.
Very scary.
Yeah, very scary. Not that you shouldn't go. If you have the opportunity to go,
really
you should
cool.
definitely go. Yeah, I mean, that's the unofficial capital. La Paz is the unofficial capital of Bolivia, so their president currently lives there. This might be a good time to talk about their political situation.
The political situation in Bolivia is very interesting and a little complicated. They are officially a socialist government, but because of the levels of poverty and the infrastructure, and the current president is kind of a little totalitarian, it's kind of an uneasy political situation, but not dangerous by any means.
No.
But contentious. And so the president, Evo Morales, he just elected himself to be president for as long as he wants, basically.
I think he extended the Constitution so that he could be elected as many times as he wants.
Yeah, so, but he is one of the first, or the first, indigenous president who is not, from Spanish blood, who's been president of Bolivia since 1812. Which is when Bolivia became a country officially. And so he has a lot of people who really back him and a lot of people who really don't back him, which sounds probably familiar too. So that was kind of a similarity. It's just like that the politics there's a really big divide.
Very bipartisan. Even though they have multiple political parties, it's still very sort of conservative and liberal separation. Though I would say that, like most, people sort of try to be as moderate as possible. Most people try to be as moderate as possible. A lot of some really interesting things that I sort of experienced, people, whenever I was working with these well projects, automatically assumed that because we were helping out Aboriginal or Native people, that we were part of Evo's government policy. And that was definitely not the case. We were there working as an independent, non-governmental organization, charitable organization. We were not in any way affiliated or any way accepting funding or resources from the government in Bolivia. But people said, tell Evo thank you, or thank God for Evo Morales. And I'm like, I never met him, and he has nothing to do with what we're doing. So it's really, very interesting and very complicated social and political situation. So.
I feel like I had another thought on that, but I can't remember what it was.
We can come back to that.
We can.
And one of the last categories, I guess, before we wrap up. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Evo is not particularly friendly with the United States, but most of the people that we talked to were very friendly.
Oh, absolutely.
And very welcoming, and knew a lot about the U.S. and our political system and things that I just never would have imagined.
In this little village of 500 people where there's one satellite phone, no internet, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, somebody asked me, and this is in 2015 when we were there?
Yeah, so 2015,
before the 2016 election. Who do you think's going to win the election? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? He hadn't seen a TV to see the news. So
and Donald Trump had just announced his running maybe 2 weeks before we went to Bolivia.
I was absolutely stunned that these people were so well informed on U.S. policy, and I had so little information really upon arrival about what their situation was. So super awesome. Love those people. Would love to go back someday. Anyway.
Sorry.
So, to wrap it up, food.
The best part.
The best part. You want to talk about your food experiences?
Your food experience is probably more interesting. I will say, so probably one of the myths that even I had, we'd been to Bolivia before, But you think about like Latin American food being very similar to like Mexican food being the same as Latin American food. And we actually had quite a time finding Mexican food in Bolivia. We love tacos and couldn't find any for a long time. So the food there is a little bit more bland than I expected. You know, I expect a lot of spices and things like that, but it's very heavy on the starches.
Yeah.
And they eat a root called yuca, which is like a potato. And then usually you have like a meat yuca. You might have potatoes. You might have French fries. You might have, it's a lot of fried and very heavy food.
Yeah, if you're not a fan of starch, you might find salad to be your best bet, because I have a feeling that most of the plates that I ate consisted of at least 2 types of starch, if not 3 or 4. Usually yuca, potatoes, you know, pasta, beans, rice, or sometimes all of that, and then it's some sort of usually grilled, maybe slightly seasoned meat. Some of the more interesting foods that I experienced in the actual desert part of the Chaco, when it's very windy, you know, and people are working in primitive sort of kitchen environments, it's very difficult to keep dust from the air from landing in your food. So you just sort of deal with it. And I remember very distinctly one of my first trips out, this little old lady had given me this chicken and rice soup that she made, or this sort of chicken and rice stew. And as I put my spoon in the bowl, I could feel every little grain of sand grinding against the side of the bowl and the spoon. And I was like, this is going to crunch, even though it's soup and it's not really supposed to be crunchy. But at the same time, you know, I had some wonderful food, wonderful experiences. Another time, we had a larger group out digging a well at a farm area in one of these rural villages, and they slaughtered a pig and slaughtered a duck. I had never had duck before, but freshly slaughtered duck is delicious. And probably the craziest thing that I've eaten was, we were in the desert. We're there drilling wells, so there's no actual ground water source. And one of the pastors who we partnered with, he was a local community leader, had fried fish. And even the guy that I was with said, "Where did you get fish this far away from any water?" And the fish were so deep fried that they were crispy all the way through. There was no soft part of it. And the bones were left in, and you were just supposed to eat the bones with the fish, so I ate the bones with the fish. It's very interesting. Not necessarily my favorite, but if I was offered it again, I would definitely eat it. So,
yeah. Other food?
Other
PK
food?
Macho?
Oh, yeah. So, the food that I believe that you all will be eating is
Silpancho?
Silpancho, which we believe is actually the same dish, which is referred to as pique macho in Santa Cruz. So there's a lot of cultural differences. You know, one town will call one dish one thing, one town will call a dish another thing. Just like in the U.S., right? You've got different names, different regional names for different
Gumbo
dishes.
versus stew. I don't know.
Yeah, whatever.
Something.
Stew versus
It's
soup.
a very
versus
similar dish, according to the internet.
We have definitely eaten the Santa Cruz version, which is usually it usually consists of a bed of French fries covered with either chicken or steak or sausage or all three, and some sort of red sauce, and then typically it has a couple of hard-boiled eggs on it, which sounded very similar to Silpancho, and I hope that you all enjoy your dinner. I hope that you feel that this was educational, and if you have any questions for us, send them to Jada, and we'll do our best to get back with you.
Yeah, we really appreciate getting to talk with you, and if you ever get the chance to travel, we recommend that you take it.
All right. Bye.
Bye.